good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact's AIPP's webinar series on the occasion of the 13th International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples 2020. The overall theme of this seminar is self-determination and democratization. Where are we heading? I hope you have joined previous webinar sessions on different issues and heard the experiences of different Indigenous men and women from different levels, as well as from our partners and allies. This is session 6, focusing on Indigenous women's rights and struggles, reflection, actions, and way forward. Thank you for joining this session. I am Elena Horo, moderating this session. I represent Munda Indigenous peoples from mainland India. I'm the Executive Council member of AIPP, convener of Indigenous Women Program Committee in AIPP. I'm also a steering committee member of Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, founder of Adivasi Women's Network and Women and Gender Resource Center, as well as founder and advisor of Interstate Adivasi Women's Network. Academically, I have a master's degree in women's studies. For more than 14 years, I'm advocating on women and gender issues, human rights of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, natural resource management from local to global level, focusing on CEDAW, CSW, MRIP, UNPFI, and WCIP. Thank you, AIPP, for entrusting me a role of moderator of this session, which is dedicated to Indigenous women. I welcome all the speakers and attendees once again in the 6th session. Self-determination and democratization are key foundations for Indigenous peoples and are the drivers of Indigenous peoples' struggles over the period. Indigenous women's contributions to these struggles are gradually recognized more at frontline and invisible and changing tiers. In the collective movements of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women for our identity, dignity, human rights, our rights to land, territories, and resources, Indigenous women face different and disproportionate challenges and additional barriers which are gender and ethnic based. Militarization, gender-based violence, criminalization while practicing their Indigenous knowledge and practices are to mention a few. Our participation and representation in decision-making is profoundly limited. Emergencies like COVID-19 and climate change hit us hard, differentially, and inequitably. Indigenous peoples' rights are assured by UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, mentioning special needs of Indigenous women. However, the UN Report 2019 on UNDRIP implementation revealed that the progress has been slow and the situation of Indigenous women, children, and youth are grave. Global Sustainable Development Report 2019 has indicated worsening gender disparity and foreseen it as one of the greatest challenges to achieve sustainable development goals. Similarly, CEDAW, as one of the dedicated instruments of women's rights, is not able to comprehend Indigenous women's issues as a holistic approach, only fragmentedly touched upon our issues. Partnership and collaboration with different actors and allies are important more than ever, especially for women's movement, as well as collective movement of Indigenous peoples to uphold Indigenous women's rights for social and gender justice. While commemorating International Indigenous Peoples Day, today we Indigenous women in Asia are going to reflect and assess the situation of Indigenous women's rights in view of UNDRIP and CEDAW, and analyze our movements as women, as Indigenous peoples, and more particularly as Indigenous women. We will try to reflect on, first, where do we see Indigenous women's movement in Indigenous peoples and women's movement at different levels? Second, how different movements can collectively contribute to initiate changes and transformations for Indigenous women's rights. Third, Why and where Indigenous women need attention from different stakeholders at different levels. Fourth, how to build interlinkages and strengthen our movements collectively. To respond to these questions, we have 4 panelists and 2 special remarks. I will introduce them before their presentation. So before entering into the presentation, I would take this opportunity to explain that we will have question and answer after 2 presentations each. So if you have any questions, please drop your questions in question and answer box, which is right side corner of your device. Please keep your questions short and concise and mention the name of the person whom your question is for. With this, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Devi Agrani from Indonesia. Ms. Devi was born as part of the Taluk people, Taluk Kuantan indigenous community in Sumatra, Indonesia. Her community of communal life was destroyed after forest concession. Timber plantation, oil palm plantation, and mining seized her customary land and natural resources. Ms. Devi is currently president of Perempuan Aman from 2015 until now. Since 1999, she has initiated Perempuan Aman as the wing organization of Aman. She has been working for almost 20 years as indigenous activist in Indonesia. Her fields of expertise on building movement among indigenous peoples, especially indigenous women. She has initiated and founded Hakiki Foundation in 1999, focusing on empowering women and indigenous peoples and Indigenous Peoples Alliance in Riau in 2000. She also managed various NGOs involved in social awareness raising, capacity building of indigenous peoples and indigenous women as trainer and facilitator. Welcome to Devi, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Elina. Good morning, good evening, I don't know, afternoon for the whole who is attended this webinar. Thank you for this opportunity for Asia Indigenous People Pact invite me to share our experience. I'm working for Indigenous Women Association in Indonesia. We call Perempuan Aman. We are working in with the 55 local chapter based on individual members. But I don't want to explain more just about the Perempuan Aman, but we are talking about the Indigenous women movement, right, in Asia. This is you can see the presentation, and you can see how far and how many local chapter in Indonesia, and you can imagine we are working in the Asia too. This is a lot of indigenous women as an individual to be involved on this movement now. The next slide, please. I just want to invite you to see what happened in the indigenous women in the community level. If we look at the indigenous women role and function, is a very key role in the community. They always making this decision. Is a very important about the daily life, such as farm work and the choice of crops on the family, daily food supply, contributing to the livelihoods of family and communities. But this is like a part of their struggle too, because it's not really recognized by even for the communities as their roles. Yeah, this is knowledge. It's not like take it for granted for is their duty. But this is still hanging in the community level. And indigenous women groups is still informal groups in the community level. lack of access to information, like to see what the development is, or the relation with the state as citizenships, and they are not really understand about the regulation policy. This is still like this situation in the community level. And then if you look more, sorry, I forgot. Uh, a lot of indigenous women still low self-esteem because the limitation of knowledge is not about their knowledge. This is about the how to see their as an indigenous woman to be a part of the community, to be a part of the state, and this is like their relation and their position on that. I say this is like a political consciousness of the indigenous women still not yet there. They just have a action as a reaction of the situation, but it's not really understand for the long vision. Yeah, and there is a language barrier still, struggle with that, and we still invisible, like Elina said before, but they have greater resilience on the to facing a lot of changing in their community. But in the national level, if we look at our organization, we can see indigenous women organization as a modern organization, but dominated by activists. It's not really it's not easy for indigenous women from the community to be involved on that. Still need a lot of effort to do that. But this situation, we talk about the who will lead them, who will support them, who will to make it there visible as a indigenous woman perspective and interest, and they put on that decision making process and in various level. Because this organization still have a limitation due the number and distribution of the leadership. Still, it's not really can facilitate them everywhere. And this in this organization, national level, yeah, we see there is people with the good capability for advocacy, management, organizational issues, articulative, but they still to be a representative. No? They have a network to do that. Why I look at this community level and the national level, because we want to see what happened in the indigenous women now. If we look at that, this is the Perempuan Aman experience working with the indigenous women. We talk about our territory to know what is it, to make it visibility our perspective and interest. We're talking about the data. It's a very important for us to show our existence. We can using the data to communicate with others, and we want to put the data using our tools to measure and to reach our opinion about our what is knowledge, what is prosperity from our side. It's not just the government or outside what you call try to push us to see as our vision. We want to say we use the data using our parameter indicator that can reach our vulnerability and our strength to put on that. It's not just because the indigenous woman talking about the collective and responsibility as a part of the communal life. And we want using the indigenous woman knowledge to reach different movement. If we want to see this is the dynamic movement, it's not just like a static, if like a stigma for us as indigenous people is like a static situation, but no, we want to say this is dynamic movement. You can see what happened in the village and community, how they can adapt with the all the changing and they are facing now, and how they can build the new relation in their family and community, and even with the men as a group in the community, for exercising their rights more equal now. Yeah, because they already have knowledge, they have data, and they more confident to be talking by themselves. And if we look at this situation, the community and national level, we want to say we need the transformation indigenous women groups from the informal situation to be more formal, be more strategic with the political consciousness, what they want to do, what they want to achieve, and the vision for the long time. This is a good for us to see our find a way our character of organization. It's a bit different with other movement because we are indigenous women, a part of indigenous people, but we still have our special needs to be rise up. If you look at the policy, even in Indonesia or other like Philippines, they have Indigenous People Rights Act, especially mentioned explicitly about the women's right, but it's not really implementing until now. This is talking about the because we are not because we are not visible. We don't have a data to show to the government. That's why it's not easy for them to refer our situation, yeah, to be a part of their decision making process. And there is affirmative action in the policy in the regulation, but affirmative action is just like in the document. The government should be provide the infrastructure to help them, yeah, to build the capacity to be reach the affirmative, like school, yes, Elena, and others. And this is like for us, it's very important to be talking about leadership, the strategic position in the village, in the community, until the national level. I think this is our experience. I hope we can discuss later. Thank you. Back to Elena.
Thank you, Devi. You highlighted very importantly the issues of indigenous women, capacity of advocacy management, institutional situations as barriers to indigenous women movement in Indonesia. This clearly states the areas we need to consider strengthening our movements. Hence, we need to make our movements visible and promote indigenous knowledge for better links development. Thank you once again. Now, may I introduce our second panelist, Ms. Yun Mane. Ms. Mane is an indigenous woman from Mondul Kiri in the northeast of Cambodia. She graduated in law from Royal University of Law and Economics and hold master's degree from Cambodia University of Socialist. Ms. Mane is attorney at law. She is a member of CIWWG, the former chair of the Cambodia Indigenous Youth Association, Cambodia Center for Human Rights Youth Council, Cambodia, and to promote Kui culture. Welcome, Mane. Floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, everyone, and good afternoon from Cambodia. So firstly, I would like to thank you to AIPP for organizing such this important meeting for sharing about the indigenous people rights and especially on our struggle. And also, I would like to thank to all the participants who are joining with this session. So actually, I would like to share about the situation of indigenous people rights, especially for the women in Cambodia. Actually, it's not much different from what Elena and our sister Devi sharing. Our rights and our uh, struggling, it's not much different. But I just want to tell more about the specific case of the Cambodia. When we're talking about the rights, actually we are indigenous women. We are very clearly understand what is our rights. And these rights have been recognized by the national law and international law. And however, the question is more about the practical. Why indigenous people, especially the indigenous women, we are, stand up, struggling to, fighting to the respect and the recognition of our rights. Because of the current development especially in Cambodia, most of the development have been very much affected to our lands and natural resources. And the women play more role, to demanding for the respect. And we have been building our movement, trying to asking and demanding for the support from the government because those development have been affected to our sitting cultivation, to our forest, where we used to collect the non-timber product, destroy our spirit forest, destroy our burial place, and also make a lot of conflict inside of the community. And right now it's not the conflicting among the indigenous community, but also conflicting among indigenous people to the outsider, to the government, and to the private sector. So this is very much conflicted inside. And one, we come into the struggling for the respect our rights. We got a lot of problem facing. We got the court threat, and personal threat as well. And also, even in the family, we have been separate. And, like the husband and wife, and we are the women play more role in active protecting our land and forest. And then somehow the husband does not support. And even the local authority, they always accuse that we are being part of the against with the development process, somehow, so on. So this is a huge problem that until now could not address yet. And when we questioning why this is increasing and happening to the indigenous, especially for the women, because there is no law enforcement. We have very good law in the context of Cambodia, recognize indigenous women rights, even in the constitution law. Yeah, even the strategy of the development for the women also inclusive indigenous women, but in the practical, most of the decision making it's not made by the women. They was exclude us from those process. That's why when the process it start, it's very much affected to our lives, to our culture, to our economic, to our identity. Yeah. However, we are still, looking for more support, and that's why we are now in the process, like in Cambodia, we try to form up a Cambodian indigenous women group, and most of the members are come from the different activists who have been affected from the threat, from the development, and so they come together and trying to find a way to support. But for me, it's my experience, I see that this is not possible for indigenous women alone to fighting to the demand the respect of our rights. So we need the support from the different actors, those including from the government, from the embassy, from the development partner, from our sister and brother from over the world, especially also like in Cambodia, we need more people from Cambodian, to support us with it. And also we need to, helping to eliminate the perception of discrimination about the indigenous women role in participate protecting their land, because now most of the, I can say, who is in a favor of benefit of selling and grabbing the land and destroying the forest, they always accuse us that we are trying to against with those development. Yeah. So for me, I think that it's very important that we need the support to helping us to provide a package of technical and financial support to the indigenous women to build a stronger role, and should appreciate to our role, in protecting the land and natural resource. This is not for indigenous women. It is for all, as you can see, when the climate change happening, it's up to everyone. So this is very important that everyone should be motivate and encourage and recognize the women's role in protected land and natural resource. It should not, aside from appreciation and acknowledgement, but they use the court case to threat. And now many cases now in Cambodia that's still in the court case, that trying to arrest the indigenous women who play more active role in protecting the land and natural resources at the ground. Yeah. So lastly, I just would like to, suggest to build the interlinkage of different stakeholders, by provide systematic support to the indigenous women, and also to provide a package of technical and finance and for personal security, for the legal aid, legal action, and also trying to improve their economic development. Because when the women play more role in struggling in protecting the land natural reserve for the collective benefit, they does not have much time to thinking or to invest for their own personal support, so they facing this as well, and there is no any much support from this. So, and in somehow this is become weakness to the women as well if we don't really support for their economic support. Yeah, so this is something from Cambodian, and I am wishing to have to get more questions, and then I can share more about what's happening in Cambodia. Yeah.
Thank you, Mane. You have clearly messaged that indigenous women movements are focusing on raising issues of land, forest, cultural conversion, and different forms of violence as there have and will impact our lives, identity, and well-being as indigenous peoples. Indigenous women's representation and participation are more dominant at local and provincial level in Cambodia, but minimal at national, regional, and global level. And this is where we need to work together collectively as indigenous women. Thank you once again. Now we'll open for the question if there are questions. Question to Devi. Devi, you have participated in different processes at local to global level, and also have been part of different movements and actors like indigenous peoples as well as women's movement. Can you share your experiences being part of women movement and representing women's movement as indigenous women? What can or should we learn from women's movement, and where are the common grounds for collaboration? Yeah, over to Devi.
Sorry, Elena, can you repeat again because my connection is not stable?
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? Clear?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So as you have participated in different processes at local to global level, and also have been part of different movements and actors like Indigenous peoples movement as well as women's movement. So can you share your experiences being part of women's movement and representing women's movement as Indigenous women? And what can or should we learn from a women's movement, and where are the common grounds for collaborations?
Okay, I think this is a good challenge for us, yeah, good opportunity, I mean, for us as indigenous women to be a part of the women movement, because we can put our issues, our special needs on that situation. For me, if we look at the shadow as a part of our advocacy, we want to say it's not enough for shadow to protect and give a space for us if we are talking about our collective rights as indigenous women. But we should mention how they can link with the UN RIP as a part of our what you call is to as a sorry, lost the words is lost, to be a part of our yes our struggle to, and link with the SEDAW as a part of we can discuss with our colleagues in the women movement, and we want to show our data to give and share with the women movement what the feminist from our side vision, yeah, because for indigenous women, we're not just talking about the rights, we have a role and a social responsibility as a part of the community. That's why it's not easy for us to discuss our perspective, and this is linkage between women movement and indigenous women movement is more enrich our vision, our way to see our movement self. I think it's a good, even for the women movement too, they can learn from us. Yeah, I think this is I can share with you from the local level until the global advocacy. Elena, thank you.
Thank you, Devi. Maybe one more question to Mane. As you have mentioned that you are building the indigenous women's movement, you are representative of Cambodian Indigenous Women's Working Group, an emerging network of indigenous women, and actively working with different indigenous peoples movement on land, territories, and resources. Can you share your experiences being part of indigenous peoples movement, representing indigenous women, the level of collaboration in issues specific to indigenous women like gender-based violence and leadership building that CIWWG is working? How we can build better of indigenous women's issues in our collective movements? Yeah, over to you, Mane.
Thank you for the question. You know, in before my experience, I think that it's easy to mobilize the women or indigenous working together, fighting, demanding the respect for our rights. But because you know, so many years there is no better solution, we are a bit exhausted. So in somehow, because the affected from the like the development, it's not directly to their community. In somehow, we are a little bit difficult to mobilize and to connect to working together. But with the current situation, I learned that, you know, if the community, you know, who are more affected directly from those violators, so we are very easy to connect each other and working together, because they are feel painful, especially by like the working group of the women. We are now is almost 54 member, and the reason we are easy to accessible and to connect each other, because we come up from the same problem, and we had the same common and goal. So we try to engage, and then the first thing, you know, this group will not form up if we don't have this problem. But since we see this problem, especially with the other current major issue about the rape and kill case to the children and the women, so this is make us very painful, and then we try to connect each other, and then we try to develop a collective plan and vision and mission together. And also we have been trying to engage with the local authority and some the other partner like NGO at the national, and especially with the UNOCHR. So we have been, you know, bring up our collective issue to the UN, and then finally we get more positive change of the support from the UN, and also we can see there is also some positive support from the government as well. You know, without you know, working together, if you are working alone, your voice will be less attention. So if we are trying to connect each other, mobilize, and then you set up the collective goal and objective, and then especially the action together. You know, if you are just thinking, building those concepts without action, that will be not much, you know, helping, you know, to build stronger or empowerment the voice of women. Yeah, so this is the most important, and we're trying to connect from the different villages at the ground, and then we link it to the national. More we connect to the national level, because there is a Ministry of Women and the other NGO who are working on women. Especially we also engage with the regional like AIPP. That's why we are now come together to talk this to in the public more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is
Okay. Thank you, Mani.
reach to your question. It's not. Is this connect to your question? It's not, just let me know. I can clarify again. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. It was clear. Thank you, Mane and Devi. Now we will go to the next speaker, and we will move to the third panelist, Ms. Yaso Kanti Bhattachan. Ms. Yaso is an eminent Indigenous women leader, activist, and scholar from Nepal. She belongs to the Thakali Indigenous peoples, whose ancestral lands are in Tasang in Maitang, Mustang district in Trans-Himalayan region bordering the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China. Ms. Yaso is dedicated for visibility, inclusion, and legal recognition to the rights of indigenous women and girls in Nepal. She brings decades of experience advocating for indigenous women's rights, and her efforts are helping to address the racial, linguistic, cultural, economic, and political discrimination that indigenous women and girls face in Nepal. Climate justice at different levels. She is one of the founding member and advisor of the National Indigenous Women Federation, an umbrella organization of indigenous women. Currently, she is the vice chair of the National Indigenous Women Forum. Welcome, Yaso. Over to you.
Thank you, Elena. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and Gorche to all the panelists and AIPP Secretariat and all brothers and sisters from around the world. On the occasion of World Indigenous Peoples Day, I would like to ask the blessing from our ancestor, God, and Great Spirit to let us enjoy our human rights and collective rights and give us courage to fight back, give us strength to fight back all the discrimination, exploitation, and globalization, patriarchy, militarization. So we need strength from our ancestor and Great Spirit. Thank you so much. So I want to focus my presentation on indigenous human rights and struggle, reflection, action, and way forward. So before saying the topic, I will focus on my movement in indigenous peoples movement. In indigenous people movement, we are together in the common issues like to uphold a dignity, distinct identity, social justice, and human right. And we want to freely enjoy our collective right, including ownership and control over our lands, territories, and resources. And also we are together for self-determination, autonomy, customary self-government system, mother tongue, customary knowledge, skill, technology, and practices, and self-determined development. And also, yeah, we are in the women movement can contribute, and we are having with the women movement also. We as an indigenous woman, we are looking for our spaces in the women's movement also. And women movement also, the women movement should contribute by accepting our distinct identity, not as a homogeneous group, as a heterogeneous group, and our collective rights. Only they talk about individual right. So also making CEDAW and Beijing Declaration Plan of Action and UN-driven ILO Convention number 169. When we talk about CEDAW, also CEDAW and Beijing Declaration also talks about 12 critical areas of concern. And there also as a woman, we have to find our space, not as a heterogeneous group. They always put us in the homogeneous group. So also scaling up best practices of indigenous women. They should learn from our movement, indigenous women movement, the best practices, what we have, our knowledge, skill, tradition, our great practices. They should learn from us, no? And they should recognize and giving a due space to indigenous women by respecting diversity, intersectionality among women. They don't consider intersectionality of women. They consider woman as a biologically only woman. So we always lobby and advocacy for intersectionality like disability, LGBTI, youth, elderly in our own, within the indigenous peoples, you know. And also partnering to specific on our space in CEDAW. We want our space in CEDAW also. We want to find our space in CEDAW. And also, they should accept increasing the number of indigenous peoples and also the colonial patriarchy, which we all indigenous women around the world are facing. You know? So also realizing the increasing of number of indigenous peoples are facing at both in private and public spheres. The customary practices are decreasing, gradually disappearing. So we want our space in the public sphere also, no? And practice equal participation and representation of indigenous women and also indigenous peoples organization. Within our indigenous peoples organization also, we want our space. So also not treating indigenous women organization as a indigenous peoples organization, because indigenous women have to struggle within women movement in the collective rights. So we are not the sister organization within our indigenous peoples organization. We are the parallel organization, and we are lobbying for our distinct issues and identity. And I want to focus on the way forward. Develop indigenous women stand based on indigenism and indigenous feminism. We have our own. When you look at the world feminism, we have a socialist feminism, radical feminism, liberal feminism. Now in the indigenous movement all over the world, we are talking about indigenous feminism also. So stick with the ground values and directive principle, both as an indigenous woman also. So and also the stop the damage done by the colonial patriarchy to the woman all over the world. And we are not exceptional. We indigenous women are not exceptional to that. And also we claim our egalitarian collective ways of life and self-determination and autonomy, self-rule and ownership over land, territory and resource, customary practices and mother tongue. So we claim all these things in the law, policy and constitution and act in our with the government. And we want to go forward by addressing all this, ensuring our rights and addressing our issue. And we are advocating and lobbying for that. And also we are coming up with the build and come up with the common stand based on indigenous feminism, and have constructive dialogue with partners and with mainstreaming women and indigenous people movement, and also with the state government development partner. We are advocating for that. And also the state government and development partners should fully compatible with convention ILO 169 by making visible our issues, our needs and our problem, in making it visible in law, policy, plan, program at all levels, from national, regional level and from the provincial level also, and establishing indigenous women section within the UN Women also. Otherwise our space won't be secured in UN Women also. Making CEDAW mainstreaming gender women empowerment meaningful and compatible also. So even in the CEDAW, there are 1 to 30 articles in the CEDAW, and in every article we as an indigenous woman, we have to find our space. In women movement, they focus us in the article 14 in the ruler woman. But we always ask are in the right to education, in the article 10 education, article 11 employment, and article 7 the participation and representation of women. There everywhere we have to find our space. So focusing and strengthening on reclaiming our ownership on land, territory and resources and customary practices and system also. Within our indigenous institution also, we have to find our space within our indigenous community, or also we have to find our space. And when we talk about UNDRIP also, the article 21 and 22 talks about the intersectionality of women. There are 1 to 46 article, but within that article also, that article are focused on women, and article 44 are focused on the gender equality of indigenous women and male. So within the UNDRIP also, they have indicated the space for women, especially in article 21, 22 and 45, 44. So that way we have to fight nationally, internationally, from the household, from the family, community, and from the regional, national to international level. We as an indigenous woman, we have to advocacy, lobby, and to find our space. And everywhere, why we have to look for the space in land, territory, and resources, and fight back for the everything which are we are facing: patriarchy, colonization, fundamentalism, all these things, no, militarization. So why we have to find? Because there are the strategies. There should be a fixed strategy, believable strategy for we as an indigenous woman in the in the UN or UN agency or in our government plan and policy. So we need to be visible, and we have to find a specific strategy that can be possible with the action, with the action, with the solidarity, network, collaboration with each other, so we can be together on that. And as a SDG goal, enshrined in SDG goal, left no one should be left behind, no. So we as an indigenous woman or within indigenous woman addressing the intersectional perspective, we should not be left out. So most of the plan and policy should be targeted on indigenous women, and indigenous, it should be indigenous woman centered. And we as an indigenous woman, we should fight back proactively, not reactively, to go forward, to enjoy human rights.
Please conclude. Please conclude. Yeah, thank you.
So we have to act proactively to move forward to fully enjoy our human right and collective right, and fight for the human, and fight for the violation and fight for the human violation of our human right and collective right together. And thank you, AIPP, for giving me the opportunity to put forward some issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yasoji. Yes, you have highlighted very importantly the collective thoughts and collaborations to fight against patriarchy, especially colonial patriarchy is important, and intersectional approach with the distinct identity and collective rights need to be accepted, and instruments like CEDAW and Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action should be made fully compatible with the UN RIP and ILO 169. And thank you for clearly putting the way forward. Yeah, thank you once again. Now, may I introduce our next panelist, Ms. Shanti Upreti. Ms. Shanti is Program Manager with International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. We call it URA AIPP. Over the past 14 years, she has worked on a range of issues in the field of human rights and gender equality, with particular focus on women's economic rights, labor rights, peace and conflict, and women's political participation. She represents URA AP in the Women and ESCR working group with ESCR Net as a steering committee member. She has an academic background in sociology and management. Welcome, and floor is all yours, Shanti.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Elena, and thank you, AIPP, for providing this opportunity. So I will, my intervention will focus on international human rights instrument, particularly CEDAW, and but before that, I'm going to share some reflections on women's movement in relation to indigenous people's movement. And many things has already been said, and I fully support that. And my presentation is also in the same line as the previous speakers. So to start with, just to begin with, we all know that there are sufficient common grounds between women's movement and indigenous people's movement. Both struggles have experienced a long-standing history of oppression, discrimination, and injustice. So indigenous people's movement have introduced some key principles and concepts, including right to self-determination, which is recognized by the UN human rights system as preamble to the framework of equality that contributed in fostering the international recognition of indigenous women as right holders. And we all know that indigenous women have significantly contributed to the global women's movement since its inception, and have played a very important role in shaping and elevating the agenda as well as the ideology, which resulted in bringing and which resulted in producing key instruments such as CEDAW and Beijing Platform for Action. And but however, Indigenous women have often been marginalized within the broader movement of women's rights. Indigenous women believe the mainstream women's movement has ignored their priorities and misinterpreted their perspectives, and previous speakers already explained it in detail. So there are like kind of number of things, and why this tension and why we have not been able to bring together Indigenous women's movement and mainstream women's movement. And one of the factors is also the lack of comprehension or understanding of some of the key concepts that are important to both movements, particularly to Indigenous women's movement, such as individual and collective rights. So for the very long time, we have to accept that for the very long time, human rights community failed to understand that collective rights are complementary conditions and not competing priorities that enable the enjoyment of individual rights. So that I think should be addressed. And similarly, there are other conflict. There's a conflict in the proper interpretation of universal human rights in relation to cultural rights also. So women's movement believes in the cultural rights are part of the universal human rights, and they are not an excuse to violate other human rights. So these are some grounds when the factors where we see conflict or kind of disagreement, and therefore I think it is very important to have clear interpretation of universal human rights, and cultural relativism is important in the context of Indigenous women's rights violation with cultural basis. And it is important to facilitate these discourses within the Indigenous community and across other movements also. We haven't seen that much happening, and it is increasing. Increasingly, it is happening, and people have started coming together, different movements, but we need more. And further, there is a need, ESG already pointed out this, further there is a need for extending the intersectional analysis to address the multiple discrimination faced by diverse groups within the Indigenous communities, including Indigenous women with disabilities and the LGBTIQ people. And in recent years, the gap between mainstream and marginalized women, marginalized movements is narrowing, and as women's movement started applying intersectional feminist lens more strongly. And increasing threats, other factors are, which was already mentioned earlier, is increasing threats and repression against the human rights community in general from different forces, including the multinational corporations and the extraterritorial human rights violation and authoritarian regimes. So these issues are also bringing diverse movements together in creating collective resistance and some forms of solidarity. So and of course the decolonization discourse is happening more than before, and the global South-led feminist initiatives are also contributing in filling some of these gaps. So I will be talking very briefly about the international human rights instruments already mentioned before. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. We all know it is a standalone global document dedicated to the rights of all Indigenous peoples. And it provides a very important political framework for Indigenous people and also covers concerns of women, such as violence against indigenous women and many other issues that Yasaji mentioned. However, we also see that it has not sufficiently covered some issues and contexts which are specific to women, specific to indigenous women, and such as sexual and reproductive health and rights. So what we can do is, it is strategic, it is important to use both CEDAW and the UNDRIP to address these gaps, these normative gaps, and this harmonization will also help in providing, will also provide a legally binding monitoring mechanism, as we know that UNDRIP is a declaration and non-binding. Therefore, it is important and it will have more value if we use it together with CEDAW. As CEDAW is legally binding human rights instrument. While talking about CEDAW, I will just very briefly highlight the strength of CEDAW lies in its binding legal obligations, obligation of states, and an overarching framework of equality and non-discrimination. So the CEDAW committee has expressed concerns over human rights violations of indigenous women, and have provided specific recommendations to the state parties after CEDAW reviews. And this has happened as CSOs have played a very big role in getting these recommendations from the CEDAW committee. And Elena J. earlier mentioned that CEDAW also has some kind of fragmented approach in dealing with indigenous women's issues. And I think I will come to that point later, because CEDAW is in the process of coming up with new general recommendation, and that is a big opportunity to make sure that indigenous women's perspectives and issues and specific contexts and realities are included in that, in the new standard, new instrument on women's movement that women's movement is bringing. So just some examples of the of CEDAW's recommendation around indigenous women are gender-based violence relating to land grabbing and militarization of indigenous areas, temporary special measures to increase the participation of indigenous women in decision-making positions. The concept of free, prior, and informed consent has also been considered by CEDAW, and they are using it to give a recommendation to various countries in the context of exploitation of territories traditionally occupied by indigenous women. And challenging stereotypes against indigenous women, and the priorities also, the recommendations are also related to intercultural education, eradication of harmful traditional practices, and extraterritorial obligation of the state in addressing rights violation, particularly in the context of extractive industries, foreign companies coming and encroaching and land grabbing, in the context of land grabbing in indigenous territories. So these are some of the recommendations from CEDAW to the countries, to various countries from this region. Correspondingly, there are, I mentioned about general recommendation earlier. There are a number of relevant general recommendations on indigenous women that are relevant to the indigenous women particularly, or can be used in advocacy. For those who are not very familiar with CEDAW, general recommendations are interpretation of interpretative comments by the CEDAW committee, and they provide guidance to the state parties on the application of convention, CEDAW convention in particular situation. So I have listed 3 general recommendations here. The first one is General Recommendation 33 on access to justice. This is very important because this recognizes the coexistence of formal and non-formal traditional justice mechanism, and this is another area where we see some conflict in terms of interpretation and understanding. So CEDAW's stand is they recognize the traditional justice mechanism. However, the traditional justice mechanism may also lead to further violation notions of rights, as they often operate with patriarchal values, thereby limiting women's fair access to judicial review and remedies. Therefore, the harmonization of the norms and practices of such traditional justice system with CEDAW's standard of equality and non-discrimination is necessary. Other general recommendations are 34 on rural women that recognizes the discrimination faced by indigenous women living in rural settings due to their ethnicity, language, and traditional way of life, and 37 on disaster recognizes the disproportionate impact of negative impact of disaster and climate change on women. Next slide, please. And the final, I'm concluding. So I already mentioned about this, CEDAW's new, the additional general recommendation, and it is important. It is important because this is also this is not just a policy opportunity for indigenous women, but we see it has also the possibility of bringing together indigenous women and mainstream women's movement. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanti, on emphasizing multiple discrimination faced by diverse groups within indigenous peoples and women that needs the intersectional analysis. Also bringing attention on harmonization between CEDAW and UNDRIP for better address the issues of indigenous women and strengthening their rights and contribution in different movements. Thank you once again. Now we'll take the questions from the floor. For Yaso, on the same line as above question, is there space for inclusion of the recognition of IP women, IP women rights in national action and strategy plan, such as biodiversity, climate, and others, including full and effective consultation and participation? If yes, how? And if not, what have been the challenges? Yeah, over to you. Yes.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay. On the same line as above questions, now, is there space for inclusion of the recognition of IP's women's rights in national action and strategy plan, such as biodiversity, climate, and others, including full and effective consultation and participation? If yes, how? And if not, what have been the challenges? Yeah.
When we talk about the national plan of action in Nepal, even the government, when there is no free prior informed consent with indigenous peoples organization or institution or indigenous peoples leaders in the plan of action. Nowadays only government are inviting them to attend some meeting, that kind of thing, but not in the plan of action they have ever included indigenous institution, customary institution. So there are a lot of challenges in the participation and representation of indigenous peoples itself, and also with the indigenous women. Though the Nepal government has already ratified Convention on Biodiversity and UNDRIP ILO, which all are related with land, territory, and resources. You know? So even when you look at the convention and declaration, till now the government has not implemented, as they have been party to all these convention, covenant, or declaration. So there is a lot of challenges that government is not including. So as a indigenous people's activist or organization, we should lobby and advocacy to find our space within the climate change or in the forest law and policy. There are good law and policy made by Nepal government, but even in the community forestry, there is a compulsory that there should be an indigenous woman in the representation. But when you look at it, the decision maker are not non-indigenous women, but the priority is not given to indigenous women in the decision making level also. And also the suicidal part is that it is mostly the politically affiliated from Nepal, from grassroots level or regional level, national level, or every mechanism, government mechanism. There is no free prior informed consent with indigenous people, and there is no participation of indigenous people. If they choose, if there are indigenous people also, they choose it by their political affiliation. So that is the suicidal for our movement.
Okay,
so
thank
that
you.
way we cannot fulfill our ensure our rights.
Yeah, thank you, Yasu. And question to Shanti. Very briefly, maybe we'd like to hear what was most satisfying and challenging in coaching and strengthening other local IP women to be leaders? Just briefly, we'd like to hear.
That's a great question. Thank you. And I don't know if I'll be able to do justice in my answer. I mean, we have been working with various women's groups and we have worked together with Indigenous women's groups in the process of CEDAW because we kind of support and facilitate women's participation in the CEDAW reviews. And if I had to say one thing, then I would say like their trust in the system. We know, you know, how challenging it is to engage in the UN system, and they are very remote, and it's and there are lots of challenges. And even if we engage, it's hard to kind of follow up in the implementation. But despite that, Indigenous women movement, and particularly young Indigenous women that I work with, engaged with before, so their passion and then their interest to kind of continuously engage in the UN systems and processes and try to influence the outcomes of those processes. I think that is very inspiring for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shanti. It's really very relevant at this time, you know, to hear from you. And now with this, yeah, thank you both of you, Yasu and Shanti, once again. We will move to the next speakers, especially I would like to invite Ms. Patricia to deliver her special remarks. Ms. Patricia is an Indigenous woman belong to Haruku community, coastal living Indigenous peoples in eastern part of Indonesia. She has been working with the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development since 2018 and currently responsible as the Associate for Breaking Out of Marginalization and Climate Justice Program. For more than a decade, she has dedicated her work advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous women from local to global. Welcome, Patricia, and over to you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, everyone. I think a number of other panelists before have been actually flagging a number of very important points, and especially also it's very, like those points are very much related to the questions that APWLD is being asked to answer, which is about how Indigenous movements and feminist movements strengthen forces to ensuring the rights of Indigenous women. I think within the limited time that we have, I would want to focus on three critical principles that APWLD believes in, which have been also mentioned a number of times by other panelists before. So first of all, APWLD believes in intersectional approach by feminist movements and the culture of solidarity as a core in building and strengthening movements. And last but not least, this is very critical that the common struggle of women in all their diversities against the root causes of women's oppression. APWLD believes in feminist analysis that uses intersectional approach, so recognizing women's multiple and intersecting identities. We believe that discrimination and marginalization are experienced differently by women based on their caste, race, class, and ethnicity, to name a few. The conflict over resources facilitated by the growing convergence of militarism and authoritarian governments increases the direct attacks on indigenous women human rights defenders by both state and private security forces. This is worsened by the absolute lack of democratic participation of indigenous peoples over decision making, especially through their rights to free, prior, and informed consent. Neoliberal globalization and corporate captures of land and resources in Asia region exacerbate the multiple forms of discrimination and violence against indigenous women. Indigenous women are constantly targeted by states and its military forces. We had been trying to collect data during the COVID-19 pandemic, and for instance, according to the data collected by Sabokahan Tomo Kamalitan, within 3 weeks only, between March and April 2020, there were 13 military attacks towards Lumut civilians conducted by the Armed Forces of the Philippines in the Pantaran Mountain Range. For APWLD, indigenous women's rights to access and control their lands, territories, and resources must be recognized and protected. And this is inseparable from their rights from the right to life and their right to free, prior, and informed consent. Something that we really believe in is that free, prior, and informed consent of an indigenous community is not an FPIC if it is obtained without the genuine and meaningful participation of indigenous women. We believe that the core of movement building is cultural solidarity with diverse social movements, including indigenous women's movement, who are at the forefront of resistance against globalization, fundamentalisms, militarisms, and patriarchy as the root causes of women's oppression. Well, last but not least, like one of the challenges when we are talking here at the same time, the most efficient tactics of capitalism and neoliberalism is to promote individualism. Similarly, in our struggles to advance women's rights, if we focus on our differences and symptoms of rights violations, it will be difficult for us to act in solidarity. But if we investigate structural causes of rights violations and oppressions, we can clearly see that we are in a common struggle, that our struggles are deeply connected. And only through collective and solidarity actions, we can dismantle the systems of oppression. I would like to believe that we are not seeing feminist movements and indigenous movements as two different entities. As a way forward, I think what APWLD really want to reiterate is that feminism is about centering women's voices and experiences at the core, as the core of the collective struggle to shift power relations, to challenging the root causes of women's oppression, and aiming for structural and system change. For us, indigenous women's movement is at the heart of the feminist movement. Lastly, feminist movements are fighting to dismantle patriarchy. For APWLD, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. It is not a power offer, but it is solidarity and power sharing. Something that we have learned a lot from indigenous women's movements in many corners of the world. Thank you so much, Elena.
Thank you, Patricia. Yes, you reinforced very importantly that intersectional approach for indigenous women movement, which APWLD advocates. You made it clear that collective rights of indigenous women are not separable from their individual rights. Thank you once again. Now, may I introduce to our next special remarks intervener, Ms. Sandra Kramer. Sandra is a Wanai Kalakadun indigenous woman from Australia. She is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance, lawyer and adjunct professor in public health at the University of Queensland. Sandra is an advisor for the 7th Generation Board Fund and of the board of the International Indigenous Women's Forum. We call it FIMI. Sandra was awarded a member of the Order of Australia Award on the Queen's Birthday 2019 by the Attorney General of Australia for her work with Indigenous women and peoples. Sandra advocates on human rights for Indigenous women and peoples. Some of her work has been writing submissions, articles, programs, short films, clips, as well as workshops to how to film and advocate your rights and violations, legal informations, right to health, sustainable development goals, and environment. Sandra has been in the international arena for many years, and in particular, working with the Indigenous women globally. Over to you, Sandra. Welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the AIPP for inviting me here today. And I'd like to recognise all our Indigenous brothers and sisters and the territories and land that we're on today and we're all speaking from or watching this webinar. It's a real great honour to be here and to be with my sisters talking about an issue of Indigenous women's that is really important for us to be speaking, and also as a collective, and for our voices to be heard to the many different nations and territories around the world. The question that I have been asked today is why and where Indigenous women need attentions as right holders and partners from different stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples, women, UN agencies, missions and donors at a regional and global level. Why? We need to have a solid foundation of partnerships with different stakeholders to campaign our rights. Indigenous peoples are the poorest peoples in the world, yet we have the richest cultures. We all share a common problem. Despite our different cultural differences, the international arena now recognises there has to be special measures in place to protect our human rights and maintain our cultural ways. Indigenous peoples in the world, we were not included in constitutions, not included in laws and policies. They left us without our rights and recognition as Indigenous peoples. It's been 97 years since the Haudenosaunee chief Deskar travelled to Geneva so that he could defend his land rights and his peoples under their own law and to speak at the League of Nations. When he arrived there, he was not allowed to speak. But for 97 years, we still, to this day, face discriminations in our countries and exclusion from the economic powers. We are forced from our lands, and corporations and mines are destroying our lands. Though it is through different partnerships that we are able to have a bit more support to urge states to implement our rights in frameworks, laws and policies to protect our rights, language, health, among others. We need a space at the United Nations, and that has been created through the forums of the Permanent Forum. We need to have international awareness as well as cooperation for our solutions. The UN arena and partnerships now monitor our rights violations, and they are holding governments accountable on Indigenous human rights and issues. Though they're holding us, they're accountable, laws and policies and everything that have been in place and that are human rights instruments have been watered down via our governments and state governments at a local and regional level. Where Indigenous people, women's and people needs attentions as right holders and partners. We need attention for our free, prior and informed consent, and we need negotiations, to name a few. We need a human rights-based approach, development in all our policies and laws and programs, and they must recognise the cultural diversity of Indigenous peoples. We need to have full and effective participation on any decisions that are made and which directly or indirectly affect our lives. As the saying goes, we need to be at the table and not on the table. Frameworks need to be transparent and accountable for Indigenous peoples and women's, our communities, and they also require our full engagement, our consultations, and our negotiations under free, prior, informed consent. The challenges that we face as Indigenous women are also part of the Indigenous struggles, whether it's on a local, regional, national or international level. Though there are mechanisms in place, Indigenous women, we still suffer from multiple discriminations. We are subjects to poverty, human trafficking, poor health, exclusion to participate, and violence, as well as many other issues that we know. Women at the United Nations at the CSW meeting, we are a minimum at that conference. I have already attended 2 of those conferences, and there have only been around about 25 Indigenous women at that conference at the CSW in New York. Indigenous women still do not have full and equal effective participation over any decisions affecting our self-determination. Indigenous women are assured the rights contained in the CEDAW and the UN DRIP. In spite of these 2 key international human rights instruments, Indigenous women still remain overlooked at issues both at a local and international level. In 2018, Indigenous women have been calling CEDAW to adopt a general recommendation on Indigenous women. Indigenous women's issues still remain critical matter and concerns as our rights are not incorporated in any political and programs. As Indigenous women, we still live under constant threat. When we speak out against injustice, and even though we say exercise our rights in peace, and we are responsible people when we protest, our land and resources are still not given that right, and that's why we're still under that constant threat. States and national reports are not accurately reporting our difficulties that we are facing and in each of our countries. What we do need is partnership with Indigenous peoples, organisations, with funders, as well as with UN governments, as well as our own government. And those partnerships must walk with us to continue our lives and understand our stories. Our lives are harsh and our history has been impacted to a point where we're supposed to no longer be Indigenous. And as we all know, we're all coming back as a collective. There are over 500 million Indigenous peoples in the world. And as a collective, we are a strong voice. So our old ways had been stripped from us of our rights. We had no protection, but we know as Indigenous people, we have a purpose in this world, in the international arena, in our local arena, in our communities and within our families. And one of the things that happen is that the international arena and those who are in partnership with us must help us transfer power, must help place the power back to us and back to us as Indigenous peoples and our women. As Indigenous women, we are the centre of the universe and we are the ones who bring the balances into our families and into our communities. And again, thank you to my sisters for having me be here. It's been an honour to hear all of the voices and the powerful conversations that you are talking about and making sure our voices are heard in the international arena via the web, because we are not silent anymore. We have to stand strong as sisters to be included in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for your special remarks with strong emphasis on partnership, human rights approach at all policy and program to recognize our distinct identity with diversity. Thank you once again. Now, as we have no time left, so I think I'll go directly to the, we will skip the question and answer, but all the questions which has raised will be shared through the email and it will be posted. And so we will go directly to the message from each panelist, and so that will be a very brief one, maybe half minutes. So thank you once again all the panelists, but this message, yeah, concluding remarks in half minutes. Yeah, Devi, yeah, just half
I did it.
minute.
Okay. For me, my message is the transformation or Indigenous women organization is very important to send them to be a leader even in the local until a global level, to raise up our voices and make it and engaging our solidarity with the different movement to support us. That's my message, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now over to Yaso.
For our movement and to ensure indigenous peoples and indigenous human rights, we should be come together in solidarity, unity, and also we should address and fight back all discrimination, and we need to get emancipation from all this globalization, patriarchy, or militarization, fundamentalism. For to be the visible, we need to be visible in plan and policy from national level to international. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasoji. Okay, Shanti, just half minute here.
Thank you. My message is in line with CEDAW because other things have been covered by other speakers. Mainly, I suggest everyone to kind of use it on the instrument. It is for all women, so we don't have to kind of necessarily find skip or look for specific recommendation. That is important, but it's for all women, and own the document, the instrument, use it, and reclaim the spaces at the international level also, because they are not different processes. They are linked to our advocacy at the national level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mane? Okay, Mane is not, it seems not connected. Okay, so let's thank you one and all the participants, our speakers, Sandra, Shanti, Mane, Devi, Yaso, Patricia, all our member organizations and partners, our regional networks, namely ICPA, Indigenous Knowledge and Peoples of Asia, IPHRD, Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders Network, AIPP, Asia Indigenous Youth Platform, NIVA, Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, IVAN, Indigenous Voices in Asia Network. I acknowledge support of our donors, namely Voice, IPIA, International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs, SSNC, Swedish International Development Agencies, the Christensen Fund, Tamalpas, NORAD, ILC, and other all donors supporting AIPP in Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous Women's Collective Movement. Thank you, AIPP Secretariat, for all the support. Dear all, concluding this session 6, we are at the moment to complete the AIPP's webinar series. The video recording of this session will be shared later. To wrap up this webinar, we will have brief closing session and heading towards it. In this closing session, one representative of each session will present the key messages drawn from their sessions. This session will be moderated by Gam Simre, Secretary General of AIPP. Please remain with us and we will resume our closing session in few minutes. Thank you all for remaining with us, and please be with us in the closing session too. Floor is now yours, Gam.
ที่นี่เป็นศูนย์เรียนรู้พันธุกรรมพืชพื้นบ้านชาติพันธุ์ลิซูและเป็นสำนักงานของสมาคมสร้างเสริมสุขภาวะชุมชนชาติพันธุ์ด้วยที่หลายๆคนรู้จักที่นี่ในนามสวนฉันกับเธอครับเราก็แบ่งพื้นที่เป็น2ส่วนใหญ่ๆนะครับโซนแรกก็จะเป็นโซนที่อยู่ข้างบนนะครับเป็นที่เนินนะครับก็17ไร่นะครับแล้วก็โซนที่2เนี่ยก็เป็นโซนที่เป็นพื้นราบนะครับ5 ไร่นะ รวมทั้ง2แห่งเนี่ยนะครับเราก็ปลูกพืชมากกว่า100ชนิดนะครับส่วนแรกจะเน้นเรื่องของไม้ใช้สอยนะครับไม้พืชเศรษฐกิจแล้วก็ไม้พืชสมุนไพรต่างๆนะฮะทีนี้ส่วนที่2ที่เป็นพื้นราบเนี่ยเน้นเรื่องของพืชอาหารนะครับที่เรากินใช้ในชีวิตประจำวันนะครับแล้วก็รวมทั้งพืชบางตัวที่สามารถสร้างเป็นรายได้ด้วยนะครับประมาณ 5-60 ชนิดนะครับเวลาเราพูดถึงเรื่องความมั่นคงทางอาหารนะครับเราก็คงไม่ใช่พูดถึงแค่เรื่องพืชแต่เราจะพูดถึงแหล่งโปรตีนที่เป็นสัตว์ด้วยที่นี่ก็จะมีการเลี้ยงปลานะครับเลี้ยงไก่ไก่ก็เอาไว้กินทั้งกินเนื้อแล้วก็กินไข่นะครับไข่พื้นเมืองก็ไข่จะมาเล็กๆประมาณนี้เท่าลูกปิงปองในช่วงสถานการณ์โควิดที่เกิดขึ้นนะครับเราก็ได้บริจาคนะครับข้าวสารอาหารแห้งที่เป็นผลผลิตของศูนย์เนี่ยนะครับให้กับคนที่ได้รับประสบภัยนะครับโควิดเนี่ยก็ประมาณ1ตันนอกนั้นเราก็แจกเมล็ดพันธุ์ประมาณ 2,000 ชุดให้กับผู้ประสบภัยโควิดให้เขาได้ไปปลูกได้ไปใช้ประโยชน์เพื่อสร้างความมั่นคงทางอาหารให้กับตัวเองครอบครัวและก็สังคมครับเราก็ได้รับความร่วมมือในการทำงานเนี่ยหลายฝ่ายด้วยกันยกตัวอย่างเช่นถ้าองค์กรในพื้นที่ก็เป็นชุมชนนะครับแล้วก็องค์กรในประเทศอย่างเช่นภาคีองค์กรต่างๆเครือข่ายชนเผ่าพื้นเมืองแห่งประเทศไทยองค์กรนานาชาติก็อย่างเช่น AIPP เป็นต้นซึ่งการส่งเสริมความมั่นคงทางอาหารเนี่ยมันต้องร่วมมือร่วมแรงไม่ว่าจะเป็นหน่วยงานใดก็ตามก็สามารถทำให้ชุมชนเนี่ยสร้างขวัญและกำลังใจในการสร้างความมั่นคงทางอาหาร
Hello to every one of you again. Now we have come to the closing of this webinar series that we have had. So including today, in the past 3 days, we have had a very reflective time, very wonderful discussions, and very rich indeed that we have all shared from different topics from the women, the youth, and others. So now in this concluding session, we also need to have a very good overview of the different sessions that we have had in the past 3 days. So to start with that, first would be a kind of summary of key messages coming from session 2, which was on towards self-determination and self-government. Where are we heading? And this would be given by Chanda Thapa Magar. She is the Deputy Secretary General of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. So Chanda, please deliver your key messages from this session 2.
Thank you, Gam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to share some key messages from session 2. The reasons social conflicts have been severe and the ability of social groups or civil society to use formal political institutions to resolve, mediate, or mitigate them has been much less effective. In this process, indigenous peoples are facing intensified suppression, experiencing rolling back of rights and commitment, and peace talks and political negotiations are reaching dead ends across the region. The situation has worsened during the pandemic, and greater challenges are foreseen with the shrinking of civil space. The rise of extreme right-wing populism, xenophobia, and racism have resulted in greater discrimination and criminalization of indigenous peoples. However, indigenous people should draw lessons from our past experiences and should not react in the same manner, but represent a voice to transcend such anti-humanism. Democracy in Asia is losing its liberal character, and the scope for protecting and promoting the rights of indigenous, especially our rights to self-determination, is diminishing. In relation to that, there was also some sharing on the concept of self-government. Self-determination is a social necessity for continuity of indigenous peoples' way of life, as it strengthens their capacity to develop as individuals and as communities based on their social order that is determined by themselves. Indigenous peoples' self-government system is constructed based on values of communitarianism and humanity of indigenous peoples. Therefore, their self-government is highly democratic, and members in the community are deeply connected to each other by practicing their collective decision-making and participation their everyday life. There are several innovative initiatives by indigenous communities across Asia, including community economy and education. So the aspect of self-determined development should also be accounted for. Way forward, we must press forward for deepening of democracy in Asia, and indigenous people have a crucial role to play in this process. The larger society should be made to see the indigenous peoples can contribute to the national and global development and settle conflicts and manage sustainable life. The right to self-determination is an inherent right that is recognized by the international laws. Therefore, we should not get stuck on the question of legality of our rights to self-determination. Instead, governments, along with indigenous people, should begin to start examining the framework for the realization of the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples for deepening democracy with a new vision that accounts for indigenous peoples' conception of self-government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chanda. Now we shall move to the other session, the report from the other session. That was on securing lands, territories, and resources, an instrument in fighting COVID-19 and in achieving indigenous people's self-determination. This would be given by Vinota Moidamai. He is the Executive Council member of AIPP and also currently the expert member of the AMRIT. So Vinota Moidamai, please present your key messages from your session. Thank you.
Thank you, Gam. Thank you, everyone. And I also like to thank you, all the panel members of my team, and also the key messages given. Let me start with giving you the main recommendations from our team. Recommendation 1 is states should promote and protect the rights of the indigenous peoples and strengthen the international and national instruments. The second point is state shall respect the treaties, accords, and agreements signed with the indigenous peoples to defend indigenous peoples' unique identity, distinct culture, traditional institutions, and governance system through the self-governance and self-determination rights. The state must end using the COVID-19 situation to augment economic growth, leading to land grabbing, violations on indigenous people's rights, including the rights of the indigenous women and peoples with disabilities. So these recommendations based on the discussions and the guiding questions: what are the trends and challenges in relation to the recognition of land, territories, and resources in Asia? The other questions was, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on the rights to land, territories, and resources of indigenous peoples in Asia? So the key trends and challenges we had: land is also land is the center as the growth even as violations, often due to abundance of resources, and most of these resources are on indigenous people's territories. And during the COVID-19, that we also came up with the lessons learning in the pandemic times is that the success of pandemic fighting initiatives can be directly linked to secure rights over lands. We have witnessed indigenous people's resilience during this period by maintaining their traditional lockdown, going back into the traditional mode of food production and other indigenous practices responding to health risks. So we need to step up our efforts in building solidarity and stronger alliance with other groups, and in this broader solidarity can we defend our rights on our lands, territories, and resources, and in achieving self-determination rooted in our indigenous principles and practices. So based on that, I have already shared our 3 recommendations, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Vinota Moidamai. I think those were very useful recommendations. Now let's move on to the session 4, which was on weaving knowledge, culture, and customary land rights with indigenous peoples' food systems. And this would be delivered by Kitisak Ratana Grajansri. He is the chairperson of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. So, Mr. Kitisak, please deliver your key messages from your session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cam. Good afternoon from here. The sessions on weaving knowledge, culture, and customary land rights with indigenous peoples' food systems concluded successfully with the participation of 128 people from 25 countries. The sessions provided a space for community representatives, indigenous activists working at country, regional, and international levels, and FAO to share their stories and experiences. We have learned experiences from Thailand, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and from the FAO. The key takeaway from our sessions include indigenous foods and conservation system provide food security, strengthen community cohesion, facilitate seeds and food diversity, enhance biodiversity, and ensure the well-being of human and wildlife. Second, indigenous women play a key role in indigenous food and conservation system. However, many ASEAN countries strictly restrict our livelihood systems. Concerted evidence-based policy advocated by indigenous people in partnership with UN agencies for the respect and legal recognition of indigenous food and conservation system is important. Third, indigenous peoples are the best conservation partners who can provide local solutions to achieve sustainable development goals. Genuine and culturally appropriate support and partnership with indigenous people should be facilitated for them to continue and enhance their local actions and initiatives. Fourth, land grabbing is facilitating environmental destruction and exacerbating rural poverty and food insecurity among indigenous people. States should take urgent policy measures to stop land grabbing and provide ownership to indigenous people to their land, territories, and resources. The fifth, indigenous peoples who still have access to forests or have rights over their land, territories, and resources were more resilient towards the impact of COVID-19 and contributed to relief work and supported other communities in need. To revivify and to strengthen indigenous food system, we must weave again our knowledge, culture, and spirituality, as well as our profound relationship in nature. These are our key points from the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kitisak. Again, a very interesting summary. Now let's go straight away to session 4. Session 5. Session 5 was on role and engagement of youth in the indigenous peoples movement, looking at the past, present, and future. This will be presented by Kejung. He is from the Indigenous Peoples Partnership from Myanmar. So Kejung, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Cam. We have a wonderful panel today. It was mainly discussing about the role of the youth in the indigenous people movement. Participated from a panelist from Asia Pacific, South Asia, Mekong, and also from Southeast Asia. And in the discussion, the main finding that we have was that we are, in spite of many challenges that we are facing today, at least there are many indigenous youth taking proactive part in promoting the rights of indigenous peoples in Asia. And also in the grassroots level, there are, a realization that indigenous youth themselves are considering themselves as a second line leadership. In that sense, a lot of mobilization are taking place in grassroots level, especially the inspiring story from the Chittagong heat track, where indigenous youth are taking more active part in promoting the rights of indigenous peoples and defending our right on the grassroots levels. Also, there are many forms of activism which have been initiated by the indigenous youth, for example, through the technology, innovative approaches, and also other form of initiative that indigenous people are voicing out the rights of indigenous peoples in Asia, which we think that in the future, indigenous youth are getting ready to themselves to take up the leadership in Asia. And also there are also some new initiative in the regional level. For instance, Asia Indigenous Youth Platform, which was initiated through the Asia Indigenous People Pacts and other regional mechanisms. Through those various mechanisms, indigenous people started to build relationships, solidarities, and networking to forge collective engagement for the in Asia. But on the other hand, we also still face different challenges. For the main challenges that we find out in the discussion is a state that is imposing systematic discrimination and assimilation through educational systems and also cultural dominations. And also we realize that there are a lack of participation in decision-making process, which both in internal and external processes. For even in the indigenous community itself, we realize that there are a need of widening space for youth to participate in the decision-making process. And to overcome those challenges, we realize that there are need to do urgently that, for instance, capacity building and empowerment program for indigenous youth in Asia, especially through technology, information technology advancements and other forms of capacity buildings to break through the challenges and also difficulty that we are facing today. And by doing so, we believe that the indigenous youth in Asia are getting ready to take part in the leadership in the very near future. And also we realize that there are a need to realize the struggle that we put in our indigenous movements. Are we really envisioning for inclusive moment in Asia? Are we ready to bring different stakeholders in the moment that we are pushing forward? I think that is something that we also need to look from ourselves, apart from the threat and control that is coming from external forces. And therefore, the main discussion that we have was we need a systematic capacity building for indigenous peoples. We need to strengthen people-to-people engagement at the regional levels, and we need to widen space and opportunity for youth to participate in the leadership as well as in different policy makings. And we need to strengthen and we need to open the door for everyone to engage, not only engaging among ourselves, but we need to widen the scope of engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kejung. I think the youth have been very inspiring to us in this session that you had, and for those very reflective points and the very good recommendations that have come. So thank you very much. Now we move to the last session of this webinar series. The session was on Indigenous women's rights and struggles, reflection, actions, and way forward. This will be presented by Yaso Kanti Patachan. She is the founding member, advisor of the National Indigenous Women's Federation, Nepal. So, Ms. Yaso Kanti, please go ahead with your key messages. Thank you.
Thank you, Gam. On behalf of our session on Indigenous human rights in struggles for collective rights, reflection, action, and way forward, our key messages. Indigenous women live in a constant threat, and our movement is struggling to find a space with Indigenous people movement and within mainstreaming women movement. So marking the International Indigenous Peoples Day, AIPP in the Indigenous Women's Program has organized sessions to discuss on Indigenous human rights and their movement, their struggle, reflection, and way forward. Indigenous women movement is just a part of indigenous people's movement. We are fighting together for the collective rights, and women are one who are at the forefront to protect our land, territory, and resources, and to promote self-determination from grassroots to national level. Despite our contribution, we continue to struggle for space to be the part of decision making and our representation within indigenous peoples movement. Indigenous women movement is a common denominator of women and indigenous peoples movement. For mainstreaming women movement to contribute to indigenous women rights, they need to recognize the distinct identity of indigenous women and intersectional issue within women and other collective rights. There should be interpretation of CEDAW and Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action to make it compatible with UNDRIP and ILO Convention number 169. In same manner, indigenous people movement should recognize the influence of colonial patriarchy and indigenous community and its impact on gender-based violence and among indigenous women. And indigenous women need recognition as right holder and build partnership to campaign to their rights, monitoring on the violence right and hold state accountable. Indigenous women need attention of partners of our rights to self-determination, right to basic amenities, and free prior informed consent, and their effective and meaningful participation in decision-making levels at all relevant levels, in reclaiming ownership and control over ancestral land, territory, and resources, and customary self-government system. So we want, like SDG goal, leave no one behind. So no one should be left behind. Thank you, giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Yaso, for that very important point that you have concluded with in the women's session. Indeed, there are many internal challenges within indigenous movement itself, and those are very critical points to be noted. So thank you very much, Yaso, for those very reflective points that your session has presented. Now, as a conclusion, I would like to connect all these presentations from the points that I have taken. To start with, I think the rise in extreme right-wing populism and authoritarianism in the region has severely curbed the civic space that impacts us all across. As a result, the ability of CSOs to use political institutions to resolve conflicts and to access justice have become ineffective. That's number one. Number two, therefore, deepening of democracy that accounts for indigenous people's conception of self-government has become all the more urgent than before. In this context, UNDRIP encapsulates self-determination as an essential condition for groups of persons whose lives are tightly integrated to determine for themselves how their collective life develops, which requires not only collective decision-making, but also the ability to make that decision-making effective, a point about practically managing interdependence. In this, the ability to make that decision-making effective and practically managing interdependent means how the self and the collective is effectively affecting the development of their collective life. This implies that every member in the community is counted, especially the women who have been partially denied of their rights, including in decision making. But women's leadership is growing, and by being inclusive, indigenous movement can be strengthened by many folds. Therefore, indigenous women's power is indigenous people's power. Number three, we have learned that our lands and territories is where our knowledge and freedom sprang from. Therefore, the continuity of our identity and spirituality depends on it, including our survival itself. Which means our very capacity and means to contribute to the national and global issues that we have discussed, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, food and nutrition, etc., also depends on securing and protecting our rights over our land, territories, and resources. Therefore, it is also the basis of our capacity to be agents of change to the local and global crises and challenges. Number 4, this is the final point. Finally, Indigenous peoples talk about the unity of the past, present, and future to make meaning in our life. What this means is that we must have stories to tell to the future generations so that they are united with the past, and that the youth become the backbone of our society as leaders in the future. We have heard from the youth not only of the challenges, but that they are also beginning to find their place in the indigenous movement, which is a positive sign. Therefore, the youth represents the resiliency of our communities and of indigenous peoples' movement. They are our hope, and we look forward to them in becoming the torchbearers of our society in the future. So these are some of the key messages that I would like to connect from all these 3 days webinar that we have had. I think those are very rich, profound, and reflective for all of us to take it forward. Now, before I end, I would also like to thank once again all those people, our friends and allies, who have given us the solidarity messages, and those who have contributed to the voices from the ground, that's from our indigenous brothers and sisters. I would like to also thank all the panelists and moderators who have taken the time and prepared to make our discussion and reflection profound and deep and rich. And thirdly, I would also like to thank my secretariat colleague. I would not like to name them because all of them were involved, from cooking foods to logistic matters, for providing water and everything. And they have been running around for weeks, day and night, to make this a successful program. So for having done that excellent job and making everything run smoothly, I really would like to thank my dear colleagues. And fourthly, of course, in general, I would like to thank all the donors without naming them, who have supported us and enabled us to take forward our issues in everything that we do. So they are really critical in this partnership. Finally, I would like to thank the participants, because there will not be a show if there are no participants. And also, it is the participants whom we rely on for the ripple effect. They will become the influencers, they will become the change agents in different forms. So in the end, I think it's really the participants who are most important. So I would really like to thank them for this for participating in all these webinar series. And I now conclude by wishing every one of you a successful celebration and observation of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Thank you very much, and good luck to all of you, and hope to see you soon, sometime, somewhere, face to face, and also stay safe and be strong with our struggle. Thank you, everyone.